I was standing in my friend Claire's kitchen in Seattle, balancing a paper plate full of mashed potatoes and turkey, when her cousin said something that made the air disappear from the room. "Your mom's Thanksgiving dinner looked amazing this year," she said, smiling as she scrolled through her phone. I blinked at her, certain I'd misheard. My mom's what she turned the screen toward me, oblivious to how my stomach dropped. There they were, my parents, my sister, and a table overflowing with food, all glowing under the soft amber light of our family dining room. The same one I had paid to remodel last year. My mother wore the cream sweater I'd sent her from San Francisco. My father was carving the turkey. My sister Lily was laughing, head thrown back like she had everything in the world. The caption read, "Grateful for family." I felt the fork slip from my hand and clatter against the plate. The sound seemed to echo through the house, sharp and hollow. I had driven 6 hours up the coast to surprise them. Turns out the surprise was mine. They'd celebrated Thanksgiving without me. The chatter in Claire's kitchen continued unaware. Someone turned up the music, and the smell of roasted cinnamon filled the air. I forced a smile, pretending to adjust my plate, my fingers trembling. "They didn't tell you?" her cousin asked, still scrolling. "It looked so fun. Your mom said you were probably too busy with work to fly up." "Too busy?" My throat tightened. I nodded once, murmured something about needing to find my jacket, and slipped outside. The cold hit me like a slap. The sky hung low, gray and swollen, and the street shimmered with rain. Across the neighborhood, windows glowed gold with families gathered around tables. I stood on the porch, arms folded against the wind, watching the light flicker behind the curtains of other people's homes. Too busy. That's what she'd said. That's how my mother had erased me, kindly, efficiently, like crossing out a line on a grocery list. I leaned against the railing, breathing in the sharp air. For years I'd driven home for every Thanksgiving. I'd planned the menus, paid for groceries, sent money ahead for their heating bills so the house would be warm when guests arrived. Last year I'd stayed up until 2 a.m. basting the turkey while my mom complained about how stressful it all was. "You make it look so easy," she'd said, then brushing my hair from my face. I used to think that was love. Now it sounded like convenience. I walked down the steps and crossed the driveway, my shoes splashing through puddles. My car sat under a maple tree coated in wet leaves. I climbed in, slammed the door shut, and sat there for a long moment. The windshield wipers squeaked against the glass as I turned them on. The world outside blurred into streaks of orange light. I pulled out my phone. No calls, no texts, nothing from them. It wasn't an accident. My mother didn't forget things. She planned them carefully, perfectly, so no one could ever see the cracks. She had decided this year would be easier without me. Easier. That word burned through my chest. I started the engine, the heater groaning to life, but didn't move. I watched my reflection in the rearview mirror, eyes, hollow, lips pressed tight. Somewhere inside me, something small began to shift. I drove to my Airbnb on the edge of town, a quiet place overlooking the Puget Sound. The room smelled faintly of pine and vanilla candles. I set my coat on the chair and sank onto the bed, still in my boots. The silence wrapped around me, heavy and familiar. For years I had lived inside that silence. Every missed call, every delayed visit, every polite excuse had built a wall between me and them, brick by brick. But this was the first time they hadn't even pretended. I opened Instagram and scrolled through my sister's page. There it was again, the photo from the dinner table. Same smiles, same caption, family Thanksgiving. I stared until the screen went dark. My chest ached, but no tears came. The hurt had gone beyond crying. It was clean, almost sterile, like a wound cauterized too quickly to bleed. I thought about all the Thanksgivings before this one, me in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, saving recipes on my phone, my mom taking credit for the feast, my dad raising a glass saying how proud he was of his girls, Lily showing up late but always leaving with leftovers packed neatly in the Tupperware I'd bought. I had built those holidays. I had paid for their perfection, and now they'd rewritten the story without me in it. Outside, the rain turned to mist, soft and slow against the window. The streetlights reflected in the puddles like tiny suns. I pressed my forehead against the glass, watching the droplets race each other down. Maybe this was my fault. Maybe I'd made it too easy for them to forget I was the one keeping the lights on. When love looks like responsibility long enough, people stop seeing the difference. My phone buzzed a notification from Lily. A new post. I tapped it open. Another photo, the family sitting around the fireplace, plates, clean wine glasses raised. Her caption read, "Couldn't ask for more." My stomach twisted. I remembered buying that couch, the rug, even the matching curtains behind them. Every piece of that house had my fingerprints on it, and somehow I didn't exist in any of their pictures. I set the phone down on the nightstand and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The hum of the heater filled the room, steady and distant. Somewhere outside, a dog barked, then fell quiet again. The world kept moving, unaware that mine had stopped. I reached for my bag and pulled out the small leather notebook I always carried. I flipped to a blank page, the paper cool beneath my fingers. Across the top, I wrote the date, November 23. Then, below it, one line, "They had Thanksgiving without me." The words looked small, almost childish, but seeing them written made it real. I sat there for a long time, pen poised, until another sentence formed. Maybe Mom was right. Maybe I really am too busy. I underlined the words, then stopped. I didn't want to believe it, not anymore. I wasn't too busy. I was convenient. And convenience is easy to replace. The heater clicked off, plunging the room into quiet. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened window, eyes, wide face, pale in the streetlight. I whispered to myself, "Tomorrow I'll call her. And this time I won't apologize." The words settled in the air, steady and certain. Outside, the rain began again, a thin, rhythmic tapping against the glass like a countdown. I closed the notebook, slid it under my pillow, and turned off the lamp. The room went dark except for the faint glow from the streetlight. I lay there awake, listening to the sound of the rain, and realized something I'd never dared to admit before. Maybe family isn't the people who share your table. Maybe it's the ones who notice when your chair is empty. The road shimmered under the morning rain as I pulled out of Seattle headlights, cutting through a fog that felt as heavy as my chest. The windshield wipers kept time with the dull thud of my heartbeat. Every few miles, the clouds opened just enough to show a strip of blue sky, like the world was teasing me with hope it didn't mean. I'd slept maybe 2 hours. When I closed my eyes, I kept seeing that photo, my mother in her cream sweater, the one I'd sent last year, smiling beside the Thanksgiving table I'd paid for. 6 hours of highway stretched ahead of me, but I wasn't driving toward anyone this time. I was just trying to move. The silence in the car felt thick, almost alive. The heater hummed, and I caught my own reflection in the rearview mirror, tired eyes, makeup, smudged mouth pressed tight. My father used to say, "We're a family that never leaves anyone behind." I used to believe that. Somewhere between their comfort and my exhaustion, the meaning had changed. The rain started again, soft at first, then steady. The gray Pacific air pressed against the windows, cold and salty. I drove past signs for Olympia, then Tacoma, places that once meant home but now looked like strangers. My phone buzzed once, a text from a coworker about Monday's project. Nothing from my family. It was strange how quickly absence became its own language. At a diner off Highway 101, I stopped for gas and coffee. The waitress called me sweetheart and poured my cup to the brim. The smell of bacon and maple syrup filled the air, and for a moment I felt the ache of normalcy. I scrolled through my banking app, out of habit, one transaction after another: mortgage transfer, utility payment, insurance premium, tuition deposit for Lily. Each line neat and sterile, like a receipt for devotion. I stared at the screen until the waitress asked, "Long drive, long life," I said, forcing a smile. She laughed softly and topped off my coffee. When she walked away, I kept staring at those numbers. They didn't just represent money. They were the invisible threads that had kept my family standing. And I'd been tying the knots for 8 years. 8 years. The memory hit before I could stop it. I was 25, fresh out of grad school, working my first job in San Francisco. My father had called late one night, his voice small. "We're having a rough patch, kiddo. Just until we figure things out." Mom took the phone next, crying softly. "Just for a few months, Amanda. You know how your father is about pride." I'd said yes before she even finished. I'd set up an automatic payment for the mortgage, promising myself it would only last until he found work again. But months turned into years, and every time I hinted at stopping, she'd say, "You're such a blessing to this family. We don't know what we'd do without you." The words were sweet, but they worked like chains. I could still picture that night, the camera on their old laptop, showing my mother's careful smile, her hair perfect, even as bills covered the table. "You make us proud," she said, and I smiled back, not realizing I'd just volunteered for a lifetime sentence. The diner's clock ticked loud above the counter. I pushed my phone away and looked out the window. A family sat in a booth near the door, a little boy coloring his parents, laughing quietly. Their warmth looked so effortless. My chest tightened with something I couldn't name. Envy, maybe, or grief. When I finally got back in the car, the rain had stopped, but the roads still gleamed. The radio played an old song about coming home, and I turned it off halfway through. I didn't know where home was anymore. By the time I reached the outskirts of the Oregon border, the light was fading. The sky turned that bruised shade of violet that comes before full dark. I stopped at a viewpoint overlooking the coast. The ocean stretched endlessly below, black and silver, restless against the rocks. The wind pushed my hair into my face, sharp and cold. I thought about the word grateful. My mother loved to use it. "Be grateful for what you have," she'd say whenever I asked for space. Some people don't have family at all. I used to nod, ashamed of my own exhaustion. But standing there watching the waves crash against the cliffs, I realized gratitude without respect is just guilt in disguise. A truck passed on the road behind me, its headlights sweeping over the guardrail. I climbed back into the car and started the engine. The dashboard clock read 6:47 p.m. I still had an hour before I reached the Airbnb. The heater hissed as it started, and the warmth spread through the cabin. My fingers loosened around the steering wheel. As the miles rolled by, my thoughts circled back to Lily. My little sister, 5 years younger, sweet and oblivious. The one who texted me when her tuition payments accidentally bounced. The one who called me her hero. I'd always believed she didn't know what our parents asked of me. But last night, seeing her smiling in that photo wearing the pearl earrings I'd sent for her graduation, I wasn't so sure anymore. I passed a billboard that said in big orange letters, "Be thankful." I laughed loud and bitter. Thankful for what I said to no one. For being their safety net. My voice cracked on the last word. The sound of it startled me. It was the first time I'd spoken aloud in hours. The rain returned just before I reached the coast. It came down in sheets, loud against the windshield like applause for finally understanding something I should have seen years ago. I whispered to the rhythm of it. Maybe silence is the only thing I haven't given them. The road narrowed, curving through pine trees heavy with water. My phone vibrated once, an unknown number. I didn't answer. The voicemail icon blinked, but I ignored it. I didn't want to hear anyone's voice tonight. When I arrived at the Airbnb, the porch light was already on. A small handwritten note was taped to the door. "Welcome, Amanda. Wishing you peace this Thanksgiving." I stood there reading it twice. Peace. It was such a simple word, but it felt like a luxury I'd never been allowed to afford. Inside the cabin was small but clean. The air smelled faintly of cedar. A single candle sat on the kitchen table beside a folded brochure for a local hiking trail. I set my bags down and kicked off my shoes. The quiet was so complete it almost scared me. I poured a glass of water and sat by the window. Outside, the ocean murmured against the rocks, steady and endless. I watched the waves pull back and crash again over and over. The rhythm reminded me of my own life, constant, dutiful, never resting. I opened my phone again and scrolled through the familiar transactions. Mortgage, utilities, tuition. The same cycle month after month. I thought about what would happen if I stopped, if I just let the water run dry. Would they notice? Would they call? Would they still remember to say they loved me, or only when the bills came due? The wind picked up, rattling the windows. I closed the curtains and sat at the table with my notebook. I wrote one sentence: 8 years of being the family's lifeline, and no one thought to invite me to dinner. I stared at the words until they blurred. Then I added, if love means keeping everyone else alive while you drown, maybe it's not love at all. My pen hovered for a long time before I drew a single line beneath the sentence. The heater clicked off, leaving only the sound of rain and waves. I walked to the small mirror above the sink and met my own eyes. They looked older than I remembered, not broken, just done pretending. I whispered to my reflection, tomorrow I'm calling them. And this time, I'm not asking why. I'm asking what they think I owe them. The words didn't sound angry. They sounded final. Outside, the ocean roared louder now, the tide rising. I turned off the lights, crawled into bed, and pulled the blanket around my shoulders. The air smelled of salt and wood smoke. For the first time in years, I didn't replay conversations in my head or count how much money I owed someone else's comfort. I just listened to the storm. It was fierce and relentless and honest. I let it be my lullaby. The ocean fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, thick and gray, muting everything beyond the cabin walls. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, my phone lying face down in front of me like something dangerous. The silence was loud enough to make my ears ring. I'd spent most of the morning pacing, telling myself I wouldn't call, that they didn't deserve the explanation. But my hand kept finding the phone anyway. There were so many things I wanted to say, questions that didn't even sound like questions anymore. How could you do that? Did you think I wouldn't find out? Was I ever really part of this family, or just the one who paid for it? I scrolled through our old text thread. Months of my messages stacked like receipts, reminders about bills, photos I'd sent of new design projects, check-ins that went unanswered. The last one from Mom was 2 words, thanks, sweetheart. That had been 3 months ago, after I transferred money for Lily's tuition. Nothing since. I stared at the screen until my reflection blurred across it. Then I pressed call Mom. She answered before the second ring. Hi, sweetheart, she said brightly, the sound of running water in the background. Happy Thanksgiving weekend. How are you? For a moment I couldn't speak. Her voice was too cheerful, too normal. I imagined her standing in the same kitchen from the photos, still wearing that cream sweater, humming like everything was fine. Did you have dinner yesterday? I asked finally. A pause, short but sharp. Then the faucet turned off. Dinner, she repeated. Oh, you mean the little get-together we had? It was nothing formal. I swallowed hard. You didn't tell me. Well, she said lightly, you're always so busy, Amanda. I didn't want to pressure you. The words hit like cold water. You didn't want to pressure me, I said, trying to keep my tone steady. I would have come. You could have just told me. Her sigh came through the line like static. Honey, please don't make this a big deal. We kept it small this year, just a few neighbors and your sister's friends. You work so much, I didn't think you'd want to drive all this way for one meal. Mom, I said quietly, I would have made time. She laughed softly, the kind of laugh people use to smooth over tension they don't plan to fix. You always take everything so personally. I was just trying to make things easier for you. Easier. That word again. I pressed my thumb into the table edge to keep from shaking. Easier for me, I repeated. Or for you. Her tone sharpened. Amanda, don't start. You know how the holidays get. We just wanted to enjoy ourselves without everyone stressing. Everyone. I wanted to scream. Except me, I said. "Oh, sweetheart, don't be dramatic," she said, lowering her voice, as if someone might overhear. "You're acting like we committed a crime. We didn't think you'd be free, that's all." Something inside me snapped, but quietly. "You didn't think I said. You decided." She didn't answer. I could hear the faint click of a cupboard closing, the small domestic sounds of someone tidying up after a celebration I hadn't been invited to. "Is Dad there?" I asked, finally. A beat of hesitation. "Yes," she said, "but he's watching the game. He doesn't like to get involved in. Can you put him on a shuffle?" The sound of the phone changing hands. Then his voice soft, distracted. "Hey, kiddo. How are you holding up? Did you know about the dinner?" Another pause, heavier this time. "Yeah," he said finally. "Of course. Your mom thought it'd be better to keep it small this year." "Small," I repeated. "Meaning without me." He cleared his throat. "Don't take it that way. You've been so tired from work. We figured you wouldn't want the drive." "You figured wrong," I said. "You didn't even call," he sighed. "Your mother didn't want to upset you. It's just one holiday, Amanda. Don't blow it out of proportion." I closed my eyes. "You wanted easier," I said softly. "You got it," he hesitated. "Don't make your mother feel guilty. She worked hard on that meal." I almost laughed. I'm sure she did. The silence stretched until he finally said, "We'll make it up to you at Christmas, okay?" I ended the call before he could say anything else. The room felt smaller, tighter. The only sound was the heater's low hum. I set the phone down, but it buzzed again almost immediately. "Lily." I stared at her name on the screen before answering. "Hey," she said, cheerful, a little breathless. "Merry Thanksgiving. Sorry I didn't text sooner. Things were crazy yesterday." "Yeah," I said. "I saw." She hesitated. "Oh, you mean the dinner mom said you were probably too busy and you know the weather, she didn't want you to drive in the snow?" They all use her words, I thought, but out loud I said, "You could have called me Lily." I know, she said quickly. "It was last minute. Everyone was asking about you though. Mom said you were buried in work again." I bit the inside of my cheek. Of course she did. Lily kept talking, her voice warm and oblivious. "Anyway, thanks for covering my tuition again. I swear I'll pay you back once I graduate. You're literally the best. What would we even do without you?" The words slid out of my mouth before I could stop them. "You might have to find out." There was a pause. "Wait," what she said, laughing like she thought it was a joke. "I've got to go," I said. "Oh, okay, love you, sis," I hung up. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was solid, like a wall finally sealing off a flood. I pressed my hands to my face and let the quiet fill the room. Through the window, the sky had turned the color of wet ash. Somewhere out on the horizon, the tide was pulling back. I turned the phone face down and sat there for a long time, staring at the grain of the wooden table. My mother's phrases kept echoing in my head, looping like a curse. "Don't be dramatic. We didn't want to pressure you. You're too busy." Each one was a tiny revision of the truth, carefully crafted to make me sound like the problem. They didn't misunderstand me. They depended on misunderstanding me. I reached for my notebook. The first page still had last night's line. They had Thanksgiving without me. I flipped to a clean sheet and wrote at the top what I pay for. The list came easily. Mortgage, utilities, insurance, tuition, prescriptions. I stared at the words until the ink bled slightly into the paper. Each line was a piece of my life handed over without question, disguised as gratitude. A gust of wind rattled the window panes and I looked up. The ocean had vanished behind fog. I thought about how many years I'd spent trying to buy peace and how peace had never stayed. My phone buzzed again. A text from Mom, "We'll talk when you calm down." I read it twice, then deleted it without replying. The fog outside thickened, swallowing the horizon. I closed the notebook, slowly slid it back into my bag, and whispered to the empty room. "For once, I don't need to calm down. I need to stay awake." The heater clicked off, and the silence that followed felt clean, almost holy. I stood by the window watching the dim reflection of my own face fade into the glass, and realized I wasn't waiting for their apology anymore. I was waiting for my permission to stop saving people who never noticed I was drowning. The morning light seeped through the gray curtains in thin, uncertain lines. I sat up slowly, the air in the cabin cool and still. My head felt heavy, but not from exhaustion this time. Something inside me had quieted overnight like a storm that had spent all its rage. For the first time in days, I didn't feel the urge to check my phone. I didn't need their words to define how the day would begin. I brewed a cup of coffee and watched the steam rise curling into thin ghosts before disappearing. The notebook still lay open on the table, yesterday's words frozen in ink. Mortgage, utilities, tuition, prescriptions. I stared at the list for a long time before flipping to a fresh page. The title came to me before the thought did, The Ledger of Love. Every act of love they'd ever praised me for had come with a receipt. I started to write line after line, each number like a memory surfacing from the dark. November 2019, mortgage $1,250. March 2021, utilities $400. August 2022, tuition $3,000. I remembered the moments behind each transaction, the way my mother's voice softened when she asked for help, how she always ended with, "You're such a blessing, sweetheart." Back then, those words had felt like warmth. Now they sounded like a transaction confirmation. The air smelled faintly of cedar and salt. Outside, the ocean moved in slow, endless rhythm. The sound, a steady hush against the shore. I traced my finger along the list, each line, another version of myself I didn't recognize anymore. I thought of all the times I told myself I was doing the right thing, that good daughters didn't let their families struggle. But what if the struggle had been the only thing keeping me tethered to them? My phone buzzed once on the counter, but I didn't move. Instead, I leaned back in the chair and let my mind wander backward to the years when it had all seemed so simple. I was 25 when it started. My first real job, my first real paycheck, and my parents couldn't have been prouder. "You're our responsible one," my mother had said over the phone. "Your father and I always knew you'd take care of yourself." A few weeks later, she called again, voice trembling just enough to sound fragile. "The electric bill came early this month, honey. Just until payday, could you cover it?" I had said yes without thinking. It felt good to be useful, to give back. But then came the car insurance, the property tax, the new roof. Each favor disguised as a moment of family unity. The compliments came with every transfer. "You're the glue that keeps us together. We don't know what we'd do without you." And every time I tried to set a limit, she found a way to make guilt sound like gratitude. The memory of that old Thanksgiving flickered in my mind like a movie I couldn't turn off. I could see myself standing in the kitchen carving the turkey while Mom beamed at the guests. Her voice floated from behind me. "I don't know what we'd do without Amanda. She's got such a big heart." Her friend replied, "You're lucky to have her." My mother laughed softly, lucky but worried. "She's so independent. I hope she doesn't forget about us one day." The line hadn't hurt then. I'd smiled thinking she was proud. But now, years later, I could hear what she really meant. She wasn't afraid of losing me. She was afraid of losing her safety net. The memory faded. I looked down at my notebook again, my handwriting small and tight across the page. I'd titled it The Ledger of Love, but it was starting to look more like a crime report. Every number was a piece of evidence, every date, a clue in a story I'd refused to see clearly. I reached for my laptop and pulled up my bank statements. Rows of transactions filled the screen, cold and exact. It was strange how neatly dependency could fit into columns. I highlighted each one, reading the memo lines: mortgage, family home, pharmacy, Mom's prescriptions, University of Oregon, Lily Hayes. The cursor blinked at the bottom of the page, waiting for the next entry. I whispered to the screen, "Love shouldn't require accounting software." The words hung in the air like smoke. I closed the laptop and walked to the window. The fog outside was thinning, revealing streaks of sunlight that made the water shimmer like glass. It looked peaceful, untouched, endless. I wondered what peace would feel like if it didn't come at my expense. On the counter, my phone buzzed again. I walked over slowly, half expecting it to be another guilt-drenched message. It was. "Mom, hope you're feeling better. We love you." The word love looked wrong. Too easy, too empty. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my banking app. The list of automatic payments glowed on the screen like a heartbeat I couldn't quiet. Mortgage, utilities, tuition, each one scheduled to run from my account on the 1st of the month. My finger hovered over the cancel button. Not yet, I thought. I wanted them to feel the quiet first. The phone slipped back onto the counter with a soft click. The decision sat heavy in my chest, but not painful. For the first time, I felt the edges of control returning slow and steady. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of bruised gold. I lit a candle on the table, the small flame flickering beside the notebook. Its reflection danced in the window, wavering but alive. I sat down and turned to a new page. Across the top I wrote, "If I stop giving, will they still see me?" I stared at the words until they blurred. Then beneath them I added, "Tomorrow I'll find out." The candle flame bent in the draft, a thin wisp of smoke curling upward before steadying again. I blew it out and the scent of melted wax filled the air. Night fell quickly along the coast. The tide rolled in, washing against the rocks below like a pulse that belonged to the earth itself. I stood by the window watching the last light fade from the horizon. The reflections staring back at me didn't look fragile anymore. It looked deliberate, almost calm. For years I'd been the lifeline, the provider, the responsible one. But maybe that was just another word for hostage. I went back to the table and traced my finger over the last entry in my notebook. "Tomorrow I'll find out." The ink had dried, but the promise inside it felt fresh. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the porch railing. The sound reminded me of the ocean against the dock back home, the one Dad and I had built when I was 12. We'd painted it blue together, though he'd made me redo it 3 times because it had to be perfect. I used to think perfection was love. Now I knew it was control in disguise. I turned off the lamp and let the room sink into half-darkness. The candle smoke lingered thin and silver against the dim light. I stood there until the scent faded, until the only sound left was the faint, steady rhythm of the sea. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and when it did, I would stop being their guarantee. I would stop buying my place in their world. I would let the silence do the talking. I crawled into bed and pulled the blanket up to my chin. The heater clicked softly, and for the first time in years, I didn't dream about fixing things. I didn't replay old apologies or calculate how to keep everyone else comfortable. The last thought that passed through my mind before sleep took me was simple, quiet, certain. If love had turned into debt, then maybe silence was the only payment I still owed. The morning air was cold enough to sting when I opened the window. A pale strip of light cut across the horizon, washing the cabin in silver. I stood there for a while, breathing in the sea air, listening to the slow pulse of the waves. It felt like the world had taken a breath with me. No chaos, no voices, no apologies. Just quiet. I made coffee and set my laptop on the table. The login screen glowed faintly, reflecting my face, calm, unrecognizable. For once, there was no hesitation. My hand didn't shake as I moved the cursor over the bank icon. The page loaded a list of transactions I could recite by heart. Mortgage, utilities, tuition, each one a piece of my life I'd traded for belonging. "Confirm cancellation," the screen asked. I clicked yes. Mortgage canceled, utilities canceled, tuition canceled. The silence that followed was absolute. I exhaled slowly, the sound of the ocean filling the space where fear used to live. "There," I whispered. "Now they'll see what busy really means." The heater clicked on with a low hum. I left the laptop open, the confirmation screen glowing softly like a quiet witness. Then I began to clean. It wasn't something I'd planned, but my body needed movement. I folded the blanket on the couch, washed the single coffee cup, straightened the stack of books beside the bed. Every motion felt like removing someone else's fingerprints from my life. Outside, the ocean was turning gold under the rising Sunday. The air smelled sharp and alive. I opened the window wider, letting the wind push through the room. I felt the cold bite my skin and didn't flinch. I wasn't afraid of it anymore. When I sat back down, I pulled out my notebook. The page from last night stared up at me. If I stop giving, will they still see me? I drew a line beneath it and wrote, "The silence begins today." The words looked clean, final. By noon, the light had turned soft and gray. I made tea instead of coffee, something calm, something different. The kettle whistled, and for once I didn't rush to silence it. I poured the water slowly, watching the steam rise. My phone buzzed on the counter. I ignored it. A few minutes later, it buzzed again. Then again. When I finally looked, there were 3 messages. Dad, mortgage company called. Did something happen, Mom, sweetheart? The payment didn't go through. Probably a glitch. Can you check another from Mom a minute later? Please fix it before Monday. You know how strict they are about late fees. I stared at the screen until it dimmed. Then I set it face down and went back to my tea. The silence was loud enough to feel sacred. I made lunch: an omelet, a few slices of bread, and apple. Every sound seemed amplified. The scrape of the knife, the hiss of the pan, the crash of the waves outside. My life had been built around other people's emergencies for so long that the absence of noise felt revolutionary. The phone buzzed again, a voicemail this time. I didn't listen. I didn't need to. I already knew the tone, sweet concern wrapped around panic. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, like it was proof I could still exist without answering a single call. Somewhere between washing the dishes and drying them, I thought of all the years I'd spent rescuing them. I remembered the calls at midnight, my mother's voice trembling. "Honey, the power's out. Can you just transfer a bit?" My father pretending to sound reluctant when he said, "We'll pay you back next month." They never did. But I never asked. I used to rush through traffic to send the transfers. Once I even left a client meeting because my mother said the car insurance had bounced. She'd cried, saying, "You're the only one who can fix this." I'd believed her. Now, standing in this quiet cabin, I realized that every one of those rescues had been a rehearsal for my own disappearance. I had taught them that my love came with no limits. And people who never see the limits don't see the person either. The sky began to darken earlier than usual, the kind of late autumn afternoon that slid easily into dusk. The phone buzzed again. I didn't move. It buzzed again. Then again. 7 missed calls. Then 12. By the time I picked it up, there were 19. I opened the lock screen long enough to see the first few lines of their messages. "Mom, please call me. The bank just called again. Dad, we're worried. Call when you can. Lily tuition's due Monday. What's going on?" The corner of my mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about the system that had stopped protecting them. I turned the phone off completely. The screen went black. The silence that followed was strange, not empty, not peaceful exactly, but full, like standing in a church after everyone has left. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. I lit the candle on the table, its small flame flickering in rhythm with the gusts. The scent of cedar and smoke filled the air, grounding me. I watched the flame dance, remembering how their emergencies used to sound like alarms, urgent, frantic, unrelenting. Now they sounded like freedom. I made dinner as the first drops of rain began tapping against the glass. Soup and bread again, simple enough. The rhythm of the storm matched the beat of my heart. Somewhere between the kettle's whistle and the rolling thunder, I realized I didn't feel guilt. Not anymore. I felt something cleaner, distance. I sat down with my bowl and whispered, "Silence isn't cruel. It's just the absence of my labor." The candlelight wavered, but it didn't go out. After dinner, I turned the phone back on for a moment. The screen lit up like a confession, 31 missed calls, 12 unread messages. I scrolled through them slowly, not reading the words, just watching the pattern: Mom, Dad, Mom, Lily, Mom again. Like a family chorus that had forgotten the melody. For years, that list would have terrified me. Now it only confirmed what I already knew. Without my yes, their world collapsed. I powered the phone off again and set it on the dresser. I didn't even plug it in. The rain grew heavier, the sky dark and wild. I pulled a blanket around my shoulders and sat by the window. The candle flickered beside me, reflecting in the glass. Outside, the waves rose higher, white foam crashing against the rocks. I wrote one last note in my notebook before bed stopped. Not because I hate them, because I love myself more. The letters looked fragile but felt strong beneath my hand. I watched the candle flame until it steadied again, bright and small and stubborn. Tomorrow they would call again. The mortgage company would send another notice. The panic would grow. But that wasn't my problem anymore. I turned off the light, leaving only the candle to glow in the corner. The shadows stretched long across the floor, moving with the rhythm of the rain. When I finally climbed into bed, the sound of the ocean swallowed everything else. For years, I'd fallen asleep to the sound of someone else's crisis on the other end of the phone. Tonight, the only sound was the storm, fierce and honest, reminding me what silence really meant. It meant peace. It meant power. It meant that for once in my life, the quiet belonged entirely to me. The sound woke me before the light did. A low, steady vibration against the nightstand, breaking the calm like a small earthquake. I rolled over, blinking at the screen. 23 missed calls. 7 new voicemails. The morning air was cold, but the phone felt hot in my hand, as if it had absorbed all their panic overnight. I didn't answer. I just watched the screen light up again, fade, then glow once more. Ring after ring. The name flashing across the display changed every few seconds. Mom, Dad, Lily, Mom again. The rhythm was hypnotic. It sounded like the world I'd spent years holding together was finally cracking open. I made breakfast instead. 2 eggs, toast, black coffee. The phone kept buzzing against the wood, but I ate in silence, every ring dulling into background noise. The ocean outside was gray and endless, rolling in slow and deliberate waves. Each one sounded like a reminder: this is what peace costs. After breakfast, curiosity won. I put the phone on speaker and pressed play on the first voicemail. Mom's voice filled the room, sharp and trembling. Honey, the bank called again. There's been a delay with the payment. Maybe it's a mistake, but please check. You know how strict they are. The next one was Dad. Hey kiddo, your mom's upset and you know how she gets. Just handle this, okay? It'll be easier for everyone. Easier. Always easier. I almost laughed. The third message was Lily's voice, thinner, anxious. I can't log into my tuition account. It says payment pending. Did something happen? Please just tell me what's going on. The line went dead, but her panic stayed in the air like smoke. I turned the phone off and stared at the waves outside. They didn't stop moving, neither did my thoughts. They still don't ask if I'm okay, I whispered. I closed my eyes, and memories bled in sharp and quick like flashbulbs. Mom's voice years ago. Don't panic, but your father missed the mortgage payment. Dad half whispering, don't tell your sister, she'll worry. Lily crying into the phone, I forgot the deadline again. You're so good at this stuff, can you fix it? Every crisis had followed the same script. Every plea had come just before my payday. It hadn't been coincidence, it had been conditioning. I opened my notebook and wrote pattern, panic, guilt, fix, repeat. It looked small on paper but felt enormous inside me. By noon, the phone had reached 43 missed calls, 15 voicemails. The sound of it vibrating on the table became almost rhythmic, like a ticking clock, counting down to something inevitable. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. The wind was sharp, stinging against my cheeks. The beach stretched wide and empty, a streak of gray sand between the sky and sea. I walked slowly, my boots leaving neat prints in the damp earth. I tried to imagine what was happening back in Portland. My father pacing by the window, pretending to stay calm while calling the bank for clarification. My mother sitting at the kitchen table, her perfect manicure tapping against the wood as she crafted polite lies for the neighbors. Lily maybe in her dorm room staring at her frozen account screen. It wasn't joy I felt. It wasn't vengeance either. It was clarity, the kind that doesn't shout, it just settles in your bones. "This isn't cruelty," I said out loud, my voice nearly swallowed by the wind. It's the truth finally being heard. A seagull cried somewhere overhead, the sound harsh and empty. I picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the water. It bounced twice before sinking. I watched the ripples spread and thought, let them see what silence costs. When I got back to the cabin, the sky had already started dimming. The phone blinked again on the table's 67 missed calls now. A new voicemail from an unknown number. I pressed play. "Hello, Amanda. This is Mrs. Randall, your parents' neighbor. I just wanted to say I'm so sorry about what's happening. Everyone's talking about that letter from the bank. I hope your folks are okay." I froze. The shame I used to carry for them, the one I'd hidden behind polite smiles and wire transfers, was now theirs to bear. The neighborhood queen of perfection had finally cracked her crown. I pictured my mother's face, her forced smile, her careful hair, her favorite pearls, all unraveling under the gaze of gossip. "You wanted perfect, Mom," I whispered. "Here it is, perfect silence." I turned off the phone and placed it gently on the counter. The quiet that followed felt like air returning to a sealed room. I made tea and sat by the window as the first drops of rain began to fall. The candle flickered beside me, its flame small but unwavering. The scent of cedar and wax mixed with the salt of the sea. I opened my notebook again and wrote across a clean page. Every missed call is proof they know I mattered. I listed each name in neat, deliberate letters. Mom, Dad, Lily. Next to each one I wrote a single word. Mom, boundaries. Dad, consequences. Lily, freedom. I stared at the page, my handwriting steadier than it had been in years. Then I added one more line beneath it. Their chaos used to drown me. Now it reminds me I'm free. The candle flame bent slightly in the wind, sneaking through the cracks of the window. I pulled the blanket around my shoulders and let the silence fill the space they used to occupy. The rain grew heavier, the rhythm, constant against the roof. I didn't move when the phone buzzed again, one last call, faint and tired. I let it ring until it stopped. Outside, the sea had turned dark and glassy. The world was still. I thought about all the times I'd raced to fix their emergencies, all the nights I'd sacrificed sleep and sanity so they could stay comfortable. Every yes had been a way to buy peace that never lasted. But this silence, this refusal, felt like the first honest thing I'd ever done. I stood open the window a crack and let the cold air sweep through the room. It smelled of salt pine and something new, freedom, maybe, though I didn't dare name it yet. I turned back to my notebook and wrote one final line at the bottom of the page I spent years keeping their world alive. Now I'm watching it learn how to fall. The candle burned lower, the wax pooling around its base. I watched the flame shrink but stay steady, defying the draft that tried to kill it. Tomorrow I knew they would call again. They would beg, accuse, bargain, plead. But tonight the silence was mine. And for the first time in my life, their chaos didn't pull me under. It passed by like the tide, loud, distant, and powerless to reach me. I closed the window, blew out the candle, and whispered into the dark. Tomorrow their silence will come too. And for once, it won't scare me. The email subject line blinked at me from the screen like an accusation: Hayes family house under bank inspection. It had been forwarded from a neighbor I barely remembered, one of those people my mother used to invite to Christmas dinners she made me pay for. The message was short, polite, and painfully sweet. Just thought you'd want to know. Hope your parents are okay. I stared at it for a long time, coffee cooling between my hands. Outside the cabin window, the morning light was thin and colorless, stretching across the ocean in faint streaks. The water looked calm, but beneath it I could feel the pull of something deep, something unstoppable. The gossip had spread faster than I imagined. A rumor that had started with a single overdue notice was now public knowledge. I didn't need to check Facebook or the neighborhood group chats to know what was happening. I could already picture it, Mrs. Randall whispering to the pastor's wife, after service the cashier at the grocery store, lowering her voice, the neighbors looking away when my mother walked by. She spent her whole life decorating her lies, I murmured, and now everyone can see the cracks. I didn't feel triumphant. I thought I would, but all I felt was quiet. This wasn't revenge, it was revelation. The memory of my mother's voice came back to me clear as glass. People don't need to know everything, Amanda. Appearances matter. I was 16, sitting on the stairs watching her polish the silverware before our annual Thanksgiving dinner. My father had been in the living room, adjusting his tie in the mirror, saying, "We're not like other families. We have standards." Back then, I believed them. I believed that being perfect would keep us safe. That if I smiled hard enough, stayed quiet enough, no one would see the truth underneath. I'd even been scolded once for crying after a bad grade, because as my mother put it, it makes the family look unstable. I had learned silence as survival. The same silence I now wielded like a shield. The phone buzzed on the counter, pulling me back to the present. A voicemail. I pressed play. "Hello, Amanda, Mrs." Randall's voice said, kind but trembling. "I just wanted to check on your folks. It's been awful. Reporters came by yesterday. Imagine that people are saying the bank might repossess the house. Your poor mother hasn't been to church. She looks different. I hope you're all right, dear." Her voice broke near the end, the way small-town pity always did, part sympathy, part hunger for more story. I could see it so clearly, my mother in that pew, her pearls still on her eyes, cast down not in prayer, but in shame. My father avoiding eye contact at the gas station, pretending the clerk's glance didn't cut like glass. For years I had carried that humiliation for them, paid for it, dressed it up, defended it. And now they were wearing it themselves publicly the way I once wore their indifference. "Maybe now," I whispered, "they understand the cost of silence." The phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Lily. "Mom and Dad are losing it. I didn't know it was that bad. Why didn't they tell me? Why didn't you?" I stared at the message, my fingers hovering above the keyboard. Then I typed, "Because every time I tried, no one listened." A moment later, my phone lit up again. Lily was calling. I answered on the second ring. "Hey," I said softly. Her voice was shaky, full of guilt. "They said you stopped helping, that you're punishing them." I took a breath. I stopped because I realized love isn't supposed to hurt. There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear the faint sound of her crying. "I didn't know you were paying for everything," she said. "I know. I thought Dad's pension covered the house. Mom said you just helped once in a while." "They lied, Lily," I said gently. "They lied because it was easier than facing what they built." The line went quiet for so long I thought she'd hung up. Then she whispered, "I think they lied to me." I closed my eyes. "You know now. That's what matters," her voice cracked. "They're scared, Amanda. I've never seen them like this." "I was scared too," I said. "For years." Neither of us spoke after that. When she finally said goodbye, it wasn't angry or cold, it was something heavier, like realization. The afternoon drifted by in shades of gray. Around 4, another voicemail came through. This one from my mother's sister, an aunt who'd never called me in her life. "Your mother's embarrassed," she said flatly. "People are talking. She says you've destroyed the family." The words didn't sting. They landed softly like ashes. I looked out the window at the sea, the light fading into a dull silver sheen. "They built a kingdom on my silence," I whispered. All I did was stop worshipping. I imagined the scene inside that house, the foreclosure notice pinned to the front door, the curtains drawn tight, the lights off to hide from the neighbors. My mother pacing, muttering about betrayal. My father, sitting at the kitchen table, silent for once, realizing the fortress he'd built was made of my paychecks. Reputation was her religion. This was her reckoning. By evening, rain had started again. I pulled on my coat and walked along the shoreline. The sky was bruised purple, the waves breaking against the rocks in steady rhythm. The wind whipped through my hair and I let it. I'd always hated the cold before, but now it felt clean. If justice means peace, I said to no one, why doesn't it feel peaceful yet? The ocean didn't answer, it just moved constant and indifferent. I realized then that revenge wasn't meant to feel good. It wasn't satisfaction I was chasing, it was release. I sat on a rock and watched the tide creep closer. The water reached my shoes, soaking through the leather, but I didn't move. I didn't ruin them, I said softly. I just stopped protecting their illusion. The sky darkened, the last light slipping behind the clouds. When I finally stood to leave, the cold air stung my face, but it felt honest. Back at the cabin, I lit my last cedar candle. The flame flared once, then steadied, throwing soft gold against the walls. I opened my notebook, the pages already filled with months of quiet confessions, and wrote across a blank page. They built their world on a secret. I only stopped pretending it was mine. My phone lit up again, Mom calling for what must have been the 50th time. I didn't answer. I just watched it ring until it went dark. I blew out the candle. The smoke curled upward, twisting into the cold air, before fading into nothing. Some truths burn quietly, but they still light the way out. The light through the blinds was the color of old paper, soft and faded. I hadn't planned to wake early, but the buzz of my phone cut through the stillness like a thread snapping. I rolled over, expecting another wave of missed calls. There was only one notification this time, a new voicemail from Dad. The preview line made my stomach tighten. We sold it, Rachel, but we need to tell you something before it's gone. I sat up slowly, the blanket slipping down to my lap. Outside, the sea was silver and still, the kind of morning that looked peaceful but carried weight underneath. I pressed play. His voice was rough, tired, stripped of its usual authority. We sold the house. Your mother, she wants to tell you something. Call when you can, please. I replayed it twice. The second time I noticed the pause before he said please. It wasn't manipulation, it was surrender. For years I had dreamed of this moment, but now that it had arrived, I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady, ready. After all this time, maybe silence had finally taught them how to speak. I called back. The line rang twice before he answered. Rachel. His voice cracked around my name. I got your message, I said. What do you need to tell me? There was a rustle on the other end, the faint hum of a television, maybe a fan. Your mom's here, he said. She wants to talk too. I could hear her breathing before she spoke, a sharp inhale like someone bracing for impact. Hi, honey. I didn't say anything. I know you're angry, she continued. Her tone was calm, rehearsed. But we didn't mean for things to go this far. I'm not angry, I said. I'm done being angry. I just want the truth. The silence on the line stretched thin. Then Dad sighed, the sound weary. 8 years ago, he began, after I retired, we took out another mortgage on the house. I didn't speak. The wind outside howled faintly against the window as if it already knew. It was supposed to be temporary, he said. A bridge until things stabilized. But then the market shifted, and Mom interrupted, her voice trembling. We didn't tell you because we didn't want you to worry. You were just starting your career. You'd worked so hard. I stared at the candle on the table, unlit, but still smelling faintly of cedar. So, all those years I was paying your mortgage, I said slowly. I was covering both loans. Neither of them answered. I wasn't saving you, I continued. I was paying for your mistake. Mom's voice cracked. We were ashamed. You'd done so much and we didn't want you to think we'd failed. Dad spoke again, quieter now. We thought if we told you you'd stop helping. I let out a small, bitter laugh. You were right. The silence that followed was long, fragile. I could hear the faint sound of my mother crying, her sobs uneven. Not from guilt, I realized, but from fear. Fear of being seen. "We didn't mean to lose everything, Rachel," she said finally. "We just wanted to keep the family together." "You didn't lose everything because I stopped paying," I said softly. "You lost it because you built your life on my silence." Her crying deepened, muffled by something, her hand maybe, or the phone pressed too tightly to her ear. My father exhaled a sound like air escaping an old tire. "Your mother can't sleep," he said. "She thinks you hate us." I turned toward the window, watching a single gull glide across the gray horizon. "I don't hate you," I said. "I just stopped pretending your choices were mine." The line went quiet. I could almost hear the truth landing between us, heavy but clean. For the first time in years, my father's voice softened, stripped of pride. "We were wrong," he said simply. The words were so small they barely made a sound, but they echoed louder than any apology I'd ever imagined. I closed my eyes, letting the truth settle inside me. There was no rush of satisfaction, no triumphant music swelling in the background, just stillness. Mom spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your father's trying to find us a rental near town. It's small, but it'll do." "I hope you like it," I said. "It doesn't feel like home," she said. "Maybe that's the point," I replied. Dad cleared his throat. "You sound different, Rachel." "I am." He hesitated, then said, "You always were the strong one." "No," I said. "I was just the quiet one." Another silence. Then he said, "Your mom wants to say one more thing." Her voice returned, soft but trembling. "I don't know how to ask for forgiveness." I took a breath. "Then don't ask, just be honest." "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "For everything." "You're not sorry for everything," I said gently. "You're sorry you got caught." She didn't argue. The line filled with her soft, broken breathing. For years that sound would have made me cave. Today, it only made me sad. "I hope you find peace," I said finally. "It doesn't feel like peace," Dad whispered. "That's because peace isn't comfort," I told him. "It's honesty." I could almost hear him nodding on the other end. "We'll try." "That's all you can do," I said. When the call ended, I didn't move. The phone sat in my hand like something heavy and alive. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the heater and the whisper of waves beyond the glass. I looked around the cabin, the soft light, the worn wood, the candle that hadn't burned since last night. Everything felt simple, deliberate. I set the phone down and pulled my notebook closer. The black cover was smudged at the corners, the pages inside warped from salt air. On the first page was the list that had started it all: mortgage, utilities, tuition, prescriptions. The record of a life I'd outgrown. I turned to a blank page and wrote in slow, careful strokes, "Silence can hide lies, but it can also protect peace. The difference is who controls it." I read it twice, then closed the book. The room felt different now, lighter somehow, like the air after a storm. I pushed back the chair, walked to the door, and stepped outside. The sea stretched before me, endless and silver under the early evening light. I could see the faint curve of the horizon, soft and blurred like a promise. The wind tugged at my hair, but I didn't turn away from it. "You wanted easy, Mom," I whispered. "Now it's easier without me." The waves rolled in and broke against the rocks, their rhythm steady and sure. I stood there until the last light faded, until the chill bit through my sweater, until I could no longer hear anything but the sound of my own breath blending with the ocean. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like someone's daughter or someone's safety net. I felt like myself, whole, unborrowed, and finally free. The world was too quiet the next morning. No calls, no buzzing, no chaos clawing at the edges of my mind. Just the sound of waves outside, slow and rhythmic like a pulse, reminding me I was still here. I sat at the table with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands and realized how strange peace felt when you'd spent a lifetime living in noise. For years, I'd thought silence meant abandonment, that if no one called, no one cared. But now the stillness around me felt like oxygen, thin at first, then necessary. I looked at my phone. 0 notifications. No texts from Mom begging, no missed calls from Dad, no half apologies from Lily. Just nothing. The kind of nothing that finally meant freedom. I took a slow sip and let the bitterness linger on my tongue. So, this is what quiet costs, I murmured. Later, I opened my notebook and stared at the last page where I'd written, "Silence can hide lies, but it can also protect peace." The ink had dried, but the truth of it hadn't. I tore out a blank sheet and began to write a letter. Not to send, just to say what needed saying. Dear Mom and Dad, I forgive you, but I won't return. You built your peace on my exhaustion. I built mine on walking away. The pen moved faster as the words poured out. I wrote about the nights I'd stayed up working double shifts just to cover their bills, about the holidays I'd spent alone because there was always something more important to pay for. I wrote about the little girl who learned that love only existed when it came with sacrifice. When I was done, I read it once, folded it neatly, and slipped it between the pages of my notebook. I didn't sign it. Forgiveness, I realized, didn't need a signature. Outside, the morning fog had lifted. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of salt and pine. I walked down to the water and sat on the weathered steps leading to the sand. The tide moved in lazy waves, touching the shore and pulling away again. Watching it, I thought of all the times I'd done the same, rushing and giving everything, then retreating only when there was nothing left. They called it love. I called it duty. Neither of us had been right. A seagull landed near me, pecking at the wet sand before flying off again. I envied its simplicity. No attachments, no debts, no apologies, just movement. Maybe that was the real lesson. Not revenge. Not even justice. Just learning to move without asking permission. The knock came around noon. 3 slow taps. I froze, heart suddenly racing. No one knew I was here except Julia, and she'd never just show up. I walked to the door and opened it. Lily stood on the porch, hair pulled back, messily, eyes red from crying. She looked smaller than I remembered, the weight of guilt hanging from her shoulders. "Hey," I said softly. "Hey," she echoed. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside, and she walked in, clutching a duffel bag like a shield. The air between us felt tight, full of everything we hadn't said. "Tea?" I asked. She nodded, and I poured 2 cups. We sat across from each other at the table. She stared at her hands, twisting the ring on her finger. "They're fighting," she said finally. "All the time. Dad blames Mom. Mom blames you. The house, well, it's gone." I nodded. "I know. I moved out," she added quickly. "I couldn't take it anymore." There she stopped, searching for the right word. "They're not them anymore." "They never were," I said quietly. Lily looked up, her eyes full of something I hadn't seen in years, honesty. "I didn't understand before," she said, "how much you did for us. I thought Mom and Dad had it all under control. I thought you just liked helping." A laugh escaped me, small and tired. "Helping, that's one word for it." Tears welled in her eyes. "I'm sorry." I didn't cry, but my throat tightened. "You don't owe me anything, Lily. Just don't become like them." She nodded slowly, wiping her cheeks. "I won't." We sat there for a while, drinking tea in silence. Outside, the wind brushed against the cabin walls, gentle but steady. It felt like the world was listening. When she stood to leave, she hesitated. "I brought something," she said, reaching into her bag. She pulled out an envelope and placed it on the table. "It's a picture from before everything got so heavy. Mom said you took it." I stared at it, but didn't open it. "Thanks," I said. She lingered at the door. "Are you okay?" I smiled faintly. "I'm learning how to be." She nodded. "Good. You deserve that." When the door closed behind her, the silence returned, not empty this time, just whole. I looked at the envelope on the table for a long time before finally opening it. It was the photo I'd taken 8 years ago, all of us in front of the house, smiling. Mom's hand on Dad's shoulder, Lily laughing beside me. A perfect snapshot of a family that had never really existed. I took the photo down to the beach at dusk. The water was calm, the horizon glowing orange and pink. I set the picture on the sand and watched as the tide crept closer, inch by inch, until the first wave touched it. The ink began to blur faces, dissolving into color, then into nothing. "You can love people and still let them go," I whispered. "That's the real revenge, refusing to stay broken." The tide pulled the photo out to sea, carrying it away. I stayed until the horizon faded to blue and the stars began to appear. Back inside, I started packing. Not out of urgency, just readiness. My clothes folded neatly into the suitcase, the mug washed and placed on the counter. I'd rented the cabin for another week, but I didn't need it anymore. I had what I came for: distance, truth, and quiet that no longer hurt. Before zipping the bag, I sat at the table one last time and opened the notebook. On a clean page, I wrote, "Peace costs everything you used to be afraid of losing. I can live with that." I closed the notebook and set it down beside the candle. My phone buzzed, the first sound it had made all day. A text from Julia. "You okay?" I stared at it for a moment, then typed back, "Better than I've ever been." Outside, the wind had died down. The night was still the kind of stillness that feels earned. I stepped out onto the porch, the salt air cool against my skin. The sea was dark but alive, whispering against the rocks. For years, silence had felt like an ending. Now it felt like the start. The drive back to San Diego felt lighter than I expected. The sky stretched wide above the Pacific, streaked with late afternoon gold. I drove with the windows down the wind, tangling my hair, an old playlist humming softly from the speakers. These were the same songs I used to play after long shifts, the ones that once sounded like exhaustion. Now they sounded like freedom. When the skyline appeared through the haze, my chest tightened, not from dread, but something closer to gratitude. I had left this city hollowed out, certain I'd never feel safe in my own skin again. Coming back, I felt whole in a way that had nothing to do with place and everything to do with peace. When I left, I was running, I murmured. Now I'm walking toward myself. The highway curved, the ocean flashing beside me in quick glimpses of silver and blue. I passed familiar streets, the old coffee shop, the park near my apartment, the florist that always smelled like spring even in winter. Everything looked the same, only I was different. I parked in front of my building, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment listening to the ticking of the car cooling down. Then I got out and climbed the stairs. When I unlocked the door, the faint smell of dust and old pine candles greeted me. The fake Christmas tree still stood in the corner, lights off, a quiet relic of a life I'd paused mid-sentence. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, catching on the glass ornaments. For a moment, I just stood there listening to the stillness. I unpacked, slowly folding sweaters into drawers, setting my mug on the counter, placing the small notebook beside the window. Every motion felt intentional, like claiming territory. I lit my last cedar candle and let the scent drift through the apartment. This place used to feel like a pause between responsibilities. Now it felt like mine. On the fridge, I stuck a yellow sticky note and wrote in thick black ink, "My house. My rules." I stepped back and smiled. It looked almost childish, but it was mine, uncomplicated, unnegotiated. The next morning, I returned to the office for the first time in weeks. My coworkers greeted me with warmth and curiosity. My boss stopped by my desk, smiling. "You look different," she said. "Rested." "I am," I replied. She mentioned a potential promotion, something I would have leapt at before, but I didn't commit. "I'll think about it," I said. Ambition didn't have to mean exhaustion. Not anymore. At lunch, I met Julia at the small cafe across the street. She hugged me tightly before we sat down. "I missed you," she said. "I missed me too," I replied, half laughing. She leaned forward, eyes bright. "So, how does it feel? Like I finally stopped paying for peace," I said. Julia smiled knowingly. "And it turns out peace doesn't need receipts." We both laughed, the sound light and real. For the first time in years, I wasn't the friend who had to explain her family. I wasn't the fixer. I was just me. That evening after work, I came home to find an email waiting in my inbox. The subject line read Thanksgiving. It was from Lily. I hesitated before opening it. Her message was short, but every word carried weight. Hey Amanda, I wanted you to know I'm staying here in Oregon for a while. Mom and Dad are trying to get used to the rental, but they're still fighting. I told them we need to start being honest, even if it's ugly. They didn't like it, but I said it anyway. I'm making my own Thanksgiving dinner this year. Cranberry pie, the one you taught me. I just wanted you to know I'm trying. I read it twice before typing back. I'm proud of you. Don't apologize for living your truth. That's how you grow. I hit send and sat back. The conversation didn't need more than that. Forgiveness didn't always mean returning, it just meant release. Thanksgiving arrived 2 weeks later. The city smelled like roasted chestnuts and ocean air. I decided to host a small dinner in my apartment. Nothing grand, just warmth. Julia came along with a neighbor from down the hall and one of my coworkers who didn't have family nearby. We cooked together, the kitchen filling with laughter, mismatched dishes, and music playing low from a phone speaker. The turkey was slightly overcooked, the mashed potatoes lumpy, and the cranberry sauce too tart, but it was perfect. When everyone sat down, I raised my glass quietly. To honesty, I said. To peace. To earning freedom without guilt. The room fell silent for a beat. Then Julia smiled and clinked her glass against mine. To all of that, she said. As we ate, I realized something I hadn't expected. Belonging didn't come from blood or obligation, it came from moments like this, messy and real without expectations. The noise of laughter replaced the old noise of family drama. The difference was everything. After everyone left, I stood by the window watching the city glow. The apartment still smelled like dinner, garlic, smoke, and sugar. I didn't mind the mess. I didn't mind the silence either. Later, I sat at the small desk by the window, notebook open in front of me. Outside, the streetlights shimmered against the wet pavement. I wrote, "They thought silence would erase me. Instead, it taught me how to exist without them." Then another line, "I'm not the daughter who fixes things. I'm the woman who learned to breathe." I closed the notebook and placed it gently on the shelf. The candle burned low beside me, its flame steady and small. I stared at it for a long time, watching how it swayed but never went out. My phone buzzed once, a message from Julia. "You okay?" I smiled, typing back better than I've ever been. I put the phone down and looked out at the skyline. The city pulsed with quiet life, cars, moving like fireflies, windows glowing in towers, 1,000 small stories unfolding. Somewhere out there, my parents were learning to live without me, and Lily was baking cranberry pie in a kitchen that didn't carry my name. The world had kept moving, and so had I. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of waves from the bay. I opened the window, letting the cool air drift in. The candle flickered once, then steadied again. I took a deep breath, the kind that fills you completely from lungs to soul. The night air smelled of salt cedar and something new. I used to chase peace, I whispered to the dark. Now I live in it, and for the first time I believed it. The email came just after sunrise. The subject line was ordinary enough to almost miss: property sale confirmation, 1845 Pinecrest Lane. I clicked it without thinking, and there it was in black and white: escrow closed. Transfer complete. New owners take possession next week. My coffee went cold in my hands as I read the next line: previous owner of record Amanda Hayes. My name looked strange there, like it belonged to someone else. For 8 years, that address had been a chain around my neck, the mortgage a quiet heartbeat in the background of every day. Now it was gone, just like that. I whispered to no one, "The house is gone." But so is the weight. I closed the laptop and sat by the window. Outside, the light over San Diego was soft, pale gold spilling through the blinds. The city hummed awake in the distance, cars, gulls, the faint echo of life continuing. But in my apartment, everything was still. I thought about the first time I'd seen that house as a child. White shutters. The oak tree out front that Dad promised would grow taller than the roof one day. Mom had called it our forever home, her voice bright with certainty. I believed her. I always did. We'd painted that porch together when I was 12. I remembered the scent of fresh paint and Dad's laughter as he handed me the brush. "Keep the lines clean," he said. "We're building something that'll last." I smiled then, not knowing he was wrong about almost everything. Later came the holidays, the Christmas tree glittering in the front window, the Thanksgiving dinners where I cooked and paid for everything while pretending it was family tradition. Every memory tied to that house felt heavy like a photograph left out in the rain, still visible, but warped at the edges. "I kept that house alive longer than love ever did," I whispered. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a monument to duty, a place where I'd buried years of myself, and now someone else would call it theirs. The thought should have hurt. It didn't. By noon I had booked a flight to Oregon. Julia raised an eyebrow when I told her over coffee. "Closure trip?" she asked. "Something like that," I said. The plane landed under gray clouds and thin rain. Portland smelled like wet leaves and smoke. I rented a car and drove through streets I hadn't seen in years, everything both familiar and strange. The gas station where Dad used to buy Sunday papers, the bakery Mom loved for her pies, now replaced by a cafe full of college kids and laptops. When I turned onto Pinecrest Lane, my hands tightened on the wheel. The houses all looked smaller, their colors faded. But the one I'd come to see stood freshly painted. The blue door was now sage green. There were new curtains in the windows and children's bikes scattered across the lawn. A woman was planting flowers along the walkway while a man unloaded groceries from the trunk. They looked happy, effortlessly happy. I parked down the street and watched. I didn't move, didn't wave, didn't get out, just sat there while the scene unfolded like a movie that didn't need me anymore. For years I thought I believed I was part of that house. Maybe it was never part of me. A gust of wind carried the faint sound of laughter. It didn't sting. It just existed like background music from another lifetime. I finally stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward the oak tree. It was taller now, its branches stretching across the yard like open arms. I reached out and touched the bark, tracing the same grooves I'd known since childhood. The surface was rough but alive, still growing after everything else had ended. "You made it," I said softly. The wind rustled the leaves in answer. I stood there for a long time before turning back. Just as I reached my car, I heard someone call my name. "Amanda." I turned to see Mrs. Randall, my parents' old neighbor, standing at the end of her driveway with a bag of mail in her arms. Her hair was shorter now, her eyes softer. "I almost didn't recognize you," she said. "You look peaceful." I smiled. "It's been a while," she nodded. "I'm sorry about everything that happened. Your folks, well, it was hard watching them go through it. I didn't know what to say, so I just listened. They looked tired that day," she went on. "But I think maybe they were ready to let go. Your mom said she hoped you're happy." For a second, the old ache flared up, but it faded just as quickly. "For the first time," I said quietly, "I think I am." She smiled faintly and reached into her bag. "I found something when I was cleaning the garage. I think it's yours." She handed me a photograph, edges curled with age. It was me under the oak tree, maybe 10 years old, sunlight catching my hair. Behind me, the house glowed in perfect summer light. "You should keep it," she said. "That was always your spot." "Thank you," I said, meaning it. We said goodbye, and I drove away, the photo lying face up on the passenger seat. The neighborhood faded in the rearview mirror, but the oak tree stayed. In my mind, still standing, still green, still enough. That night in my Airbnb, I lit a candle. The same scent as always, cedarwood. I placed the photograph on the table and stared at it. The girl in the picture smiled like she believed in forever. I envied her a little, but I also pitied her. She didn't know yet what forever costs. I picked up the picture expecting to burn it, but I couldn't. Instead, I folded it neatly and slipped it inside my notebook between the last pages. Some memories don't need to disappear. They just need to rest. I wrote a new line in the notebook. I carried that house like a promise. Now I know it was just a place where I learned how to leave. Outside rain tapped against the window, steady and soft. I let it fill the silence. The next morning the sky had cleared, washed pale and blue. I packed my bag and drove to the airport. As the car climbed the hill overlooking the town, I caught one last glimpse of Pinecrest Lane. The house gleamed faintly in the distance, framed by the oak tree's shadow. It looked smaller than I remembered. At the airport, I stood by the window before boarding. My reflection merged with the clouds beyond the glass. "Home isn't the place that remembers you," I whispered. "It's the place that lets you remember yourself." When the plane took off, the world below turned to patchwork rivers, rooftops, fields of fading green. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. In the Notes app, I typed one final sentence. I thought I lost everything when I lost them. But all I lost was permission to disappear. I turned off the screen and leaned back, watching the clouds drift past like soft ghosts. The house had vanished, but I stayed. The morning light filled my apartment in slow, golden waves, spilling across the floor and touching the edges of everything I owned. Outside, I could hear the faint hum of San Diego, waking up the buzz of traffic, a dog barking, the laughter of a couple walking down the street. I stood by the window holding a cup of coffee between my palms, feeling the warmth soak into my skin. For once, I wasn't rushing anywhere. There were no bills to fix, no calls to answer, no ghosts to chase. The fake Christmas tree that had haunted my living room for a year was gone. In its place, a small vase of wildflowers sat on the table. The scent of them mixed with the smell of coffee and salt air drifting in through the open window. I'd replaced the noise with quiet things, fresh sheets, morning light, space to breathe. "The world didn't change," I said softly. I did. I sat down with my notebook, the same one that had carried years of numbers and guilt, now filled with words that belonged to no one but me. On the first page of the new section, I wrote 3 lines: "Peace doesn't arrive. You let it in. Freedom doesn't wait. You take it. Love isn't a reward. It's a way of being." The pen glided easily this time. No shaking, no hesitation. Around noon, the mail arrived. Just one envelope, handwritten. The Oregon postmark made my heart skip for a moment. I opened it carefully. Inside was a short letter from Lily. "Hey Amanda, I visited Mom and Dad last week. They're better, different. I think they're starting to understand things they never did before. They asked about you. I told them you're happy. I think that scared them a little. But maybe it also gave them hope. I'm still in Oregon. I've been working part-time at a small art studio. I'm saving for my own place. I made cranberry pie last night, your recipe. It didn't taste quite like yours, but close enough. Love, Lily." Folded inside was a photo. Lily stood beside the oak tree in front of the old house. Its branches were heavy with gold leaves, sunlight filtering through. I traced the image with my fingertips and smiled. For the first time, looking at that house didn't sting. I didn't want it back. I didn't need it. What mattered had survived without walls, without debt, without performance. "Forgiveness doesn't always mean reunion," I whispered. "Sometimes it just means letting the past exist without power." That afternoon I walked through Balboa Park. The air smelled of jasmine and rain. Children ran past, their laughter echoing through the gardens. I passed a young woman on the phone, her voice sharp and tired. "I can't keep paying for everything," she said, frustration cracking her tone. Our eyes met briefly, just long enough for recognition to flicker between us, the kind that only passes between people who've carried too much for too long. I smiled at her. She looked away, embarrassed, then softened and smiled back. It was small, but it felt like a baton quietly passed from one survivor to another. I sat on a nearby bench and opened my notebook again. The words came easily. "We inherit more than money. We inherit patterns. The brave ones break them." I underlined the last sentence twice. Around me, the park pulsed with life, families taking photos, street musicians playing guitars, couples sharing quiet moments. I was part of it, not apart from it. A year later, Thanksgiving returned like a full circle. My apartment glowed with the warmth of the oven and the smell of rosemary and butter. The table was small but alive, Julia at one end, my neighbor Carla at the other, a co-worker from the office beside them. There were mismatched plates, overcooked turkey, and laughter that rolled from one side of the room to the other. As I poured wine into Julia's glass, she grinned. "You've really outdone yourself this year," she said. "I didn't even burn the pie," I replied, pretending to be proud. She raised her glass. "To new traditions." I lifted mine. "To honesty. To peace. To choosing ourselves without guilt." Everyone repeated the last words softly, guilt, as if it was something they too were trying to unlearn. Halfway through dinner, my phone buzzed. A text from Lily. "Happy Thanksgiving. Thank you for teaching me what strength really looks like." I stared at it for a long time before typing back. "You're welcome. Eat something sweet for me." When the plates were cleared and the laughter faded into soft conversation, I leaned back in my chair and looked around the room. No perfect decorations, no performance, no tension, just warmth, just belonging. Maybe inheritance wasn't what people left you. Maybe it was what you finally claimed for yourself. Later that night, I stepped out onto the balcony. The city shimmered below like a map of quiet miracles. I carried my notebook and a candle, the flame bending slightly in the breeze. I wrote, "Silence used to mean isolation. Now it means choice. I don't owe anyone the version of me that kept their world standing. I owe myself the version that finally lived." I closed the notebook and watched the candlelight dance against the window. Below the sounds of the city music cars, laughter rose like a reminder that life continues even after endings. I thought about my parents, about the house that was no longer ours, about Lily baking pies in Oregon. None of it felt like loss anymore. It felt like balance. Peace isn't a prize you earn. It's a home you build inside yourself. I blew out the candle. Smoke curled upward, soft and silver, disappearing into the dark. The silence left behind wasn't empty. It was alive. I turned toward the camera, toward the unseen listener who had followed every quiet heartbreak, every moment of defiance, and smiled faintly. "I used to think silence was the end of my story," I said. "Now I know it's where the real one began." I let the words breathe. Before continuing, my voice calm, steady, and honest. "Have you ever had to choose peace over people? Did it feel cruel at first or freeing in the end? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear how you found your quiet strength. And if my story reminded you of your own, stay with me here. There are more stories, waiting stories about healing, justice, and the kind of revenge that turns into freedom. I looked out at the city again, the candle still flickering behind me like a heartbeat, refusing to go out. Somewhere below, a car door slammed, a dog barked, laughter echoed. Life went on, beautiful, imperfect, and finally mine. I turned off the light, leaving only the glow of the window behind me, and whispered the last words to myself before walking away. "This time the peace stays."